Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. In case you're new here, my name is Laura and I'm a PhD student of comparative literature in Germany. And this is my series on literary theory, in which I'm covering hermeneutics at the moment, the art and study of understanding and interpreting, especially of texts. And today I want to tackle the question, what is understanding and what is misunderstanding? What are the roots of misunderstanding? What is right or correct understanding? And how can we tackle that? And I will talk about this with regard to Friedrich Schleiermacher, a very important figure and scholar in modern hermeneutics, which I've been talking about in my last video already. I will link it below if you're interested in that as well. So it gives you a good introduction into Schleiermacher's hermeneutics. I will first talk about Schleiermacher's notion of understanding. Then I will talk about misunderstanding and where it can come from, or how it can be avoided. And in the end, I will talk a little bit about right or correct understanding. So one definition Schleiermacher gives of hermeneutics in general is the art of correctly understanding another person's speech or text. To understand what this might mean, I think we have to understand where the roots of misunderstanding actually lie. But I will get back to this question of what understanding correctly means a little later in the end of the video. In his speeches in front of the Berlin Academy of Sciences, or the Berliner Akademie der Wissenschaften, Schleiermacher established a concept that forms the starting point of every hermeneutic operation, namely that of something foreign that is to be understood. I will talk about that in my last video already. The foreign or unknown in the text to be interpreted forms the object of what is to be understood or interpreted. According to Schleiermacher, as a prerequisite for understanding, there must already be at least one thing in common between the author and the hermeneut or the interpreter, such as a common linguistic basis, so that the interpreter has a point of reference from which he can make sense of the text, or some knowledge about the person who's been writing a text, the author, or the times in which the text has been written, so that he has a starting point for his understanding, any kind of an idea or a starting point to approach the text. And this pre-understanding is actually what makes it possible for the interpreter to understand the text in the first place. Otherwise, it would be really difficult to get into the text at all. And as Schleiermacher says, understanding is made up of two sub-areas. And he says, as every discourse has a two-part reference to the whole language and to the entire thought of its creator, so all understanding of speech consists of two elements: understanding the speech as it derives from the language and as it derives from the mind of the thinker. This is important to know because on the one side you have the speech, so the language. You have to understand all the linguistic elements and the different aspects, and therefore you also have to have a notion of the language in general, and you also have to make sure that you understand the speech as it derives from the mind of the thinker, so most of the time the author or the authors, depending on the text. So what has moved them, why have they written the text, what has been the context in which they brought the text about, what has been the influence on that. And therefore, to be able to do that, Schleiermacher says the successful performance of the art depends on a linguistic talent and the talent for assessing individual human nature. So you have to have an idea about how humans work, how they think, how they feel, what might move them, but you also have to have a notion of the language. How does the language work? How can you make use of stylistic devices and such things? So this first point doesn't refer to the facility for learning foreign languages, rather it refers to a sense for the contemporaneity of a language, for the analogies and differences, and also the idea how language changes over time, and especially the use of language. So as it is important to know whether you have a text in front of you that's been written, for example, in the 13th century or in ancient times or nowadays, because speech and language change over time. The use of language changes. It also depends on the status that a person has, whether she's like a high-ranking official, for example, or someone from the lower classes, like a farmer or a field worker, a mine worker, someone like that, or some person working in an office, a teacher, a scholar, an academic. That makes such a big difference. And therefore, Schleiermacher says a great number of hermeneutical mistakes are based on the deficiency of linguistic talent or in its faulty application. So this linguistic talent seems to be a very crucial point in understanding, especially as we always have to deal with products of speech. And then Schleiermacher also makes a difference between artful and artless or crude exposition. So the idea that some understanding requires art and it requires a deeper level of engagement and also a lot of more effort to put into. And the other form would just be to try to gain an overall impression of something. Therefore, Schleiermacher says the difference between artful and crude exposition has nothing to do with whether the work is familiar or strange, with the discourse or the text, but solely with whether one wants to understand certain things exactly or not. So that's a very crucial point as well. As Schleiermacher basically says, you have to make sure for yourself, do you really want to understand something deeply on a deep level or just on a surface level? Do you just want to have an idea what something could be about, or do you really want to delve deeper into it and really try to grasp like the deeper meaning, the deeper information, the deeper messages that the text conveys? And therefore, there's also two ways to treat texts in a way, and therefore also two ways to deal with a misunderstanding. And as there are two ways of approaching texts, there's also two ways of misunderstanding, of dealing with misunderstanding especially. There's a careless practice and a strict practice. And Schleiermacher says, the careless practice of the art results from the fact that understanding is pursued in the light of a negative goal, that misunderstanding should be avoided. And this is the approach that many scholars chose for a long time in hermeneutics, seeing it as a method to bring light to dark spots or areas, and seeing difficulties arise only in special areas or passages, not as a general problem when dealing with the text. So basically they just approach the text and saying there's different sentences or specific passages which are difficult to understand, which can be elicited through other passages, for example. This is the method of comparing different parts. In German it's called Parallelstellen Methode, so comparing passages that seem parallel in their structure and their choice of words, choice of terms, and therefore seem to be comparable and able to give us a clue of what is meant in another passage. But Schleiermacher sees a problem with that, as this approach only sees difficulties as isolated problems, not as an overall problem that we might not understand something. And therefore this only becomes an aggregate of observations. So we have different observations of the text, things we do understand, others we don't understand, that just seem to stand next to each other without forming like a whole connection and a whole understanding. And this approach seems to consider itself as a specialized hermeneutics, as Schleiermacher says, because it brings special methods to the solving of difficult problems. This is how the theological, the juristic, and the philological methods originated and what they consider to be their special purposes. So, special purposes as referring to special problems, special cases, special areas and passages in the texts. But this is not the goal of Schleiermacher's general hermeneutics. As I said in the previous video already, which focuses on the general structures and what is on the basis of understanding. So when we really want to make sure that we form like a comprehensive understanding of a text, we have to approach the text a little bit differently by the strict practice. And to the strict practice, Schleiermacher says, the strict practice assumes that misunderstanding is self-evident and that understanding must be desired and sought at every point. And that's a different approach, because in one point the careless practice, or the lax practice is also called, you just go about the text and read it and just try to avoid the misunderstanding. But in this case, approach is different because it's a lot more self-reflective, as it says, okay, we always misunderstand, and goal must be to really seek understanding on every single point and every single step we take. We have to seek understanding and accept the fact that we don't understand right away. We don't understand something immediately unless we really know everything about it, and unless we are so familiar with it that it doesn't really even take a more complex cognitive process at all. So, like understanding words that you've been hearing thousands of times, or something that is just slightly different to things you already know very well, are you very familiar with. This stricter practice, as Schleiermacher says, results from its beginning with an assumption about what the meaning is that properly should only be discovered in the way the language and intention present it. There's two kinds of misunderstanding, Schleiermacher says. One is qualitatively misunderstanding the content. The other is quantitatively misunderstanding nuances. And as Schleiermacher distinguishes between qualitative and quantitative misunderstanding, he also emphasizes the need to pay attention to both in the hermeneutical interpretation process. So the qualitative misunderstanding usually refers to the semantics of a word or expression, and occurs, for example, when a reader has a view of the semantic meaning that differs from that of the author or that intended in the text. This can be caused by the reader having a different understanding of the language, or a cultural background that differs from the one of the author, which makes for a different understanding on the semantic level. And a quantitative misunderstanding rather occurs when the reader ascribes greater or lesser relevance to a certain element in the text, such as a certain motive or stylistic device or paragraph, and it's also different from the one that the author intended. That's the two basic forms of misunderstanding. So either you misunderstand something in the content, or you misunderstand something because you ascribe a bigger or smaller relevance to it than it was actually intended to. So you build your interpretation on an aspect in the text that is not as relevant as you make it. But both forms occur, and also they are intertwined sometimes, and sometimes they are even mutually dependent. Where do the roots of misunderstanding lie apart from that? According to Schleiermacher, misunderstanding occurs either as a result of haste, for example, in a single moment in which a hectic or selective reading of the text leads to hasty judgments, or incorrect weighting of certain parts of the text in relation to the text as a whole, or as a result of bias, which then leads to a lack of ability to form an objective judgment. Schleiermacher calls bias the one-sided preference for that which is close to the individual circle of ideas and the rejection of that which lies outside it. So due to this bias, the reader misinterprets passages, or sometimes even the entire text, or attributes intentions to the author that the author didn't have himself. So that's something we would really have to watch out for when trying to avoid misunderstanding, or just reflecting on the misunderstanding. So what do we learn from this? According to Schleiermacher, complete understanding is an illusion, as we cannot possibly know everything there is to know about a text or the person who has written it. We cannot know everything there is to know about a language, and also not about the psychology of a person. As we try to understand something that we do not understand immediately, which is the case for most texts that are slightly complex, it is common to misunderstand or not understand anything at all in the beginning. But with hermeneutics, we can realize this possibility of misunderstanding and try to make our way out there to build our own understanding. We have to be aware of our own behavior when reading and thinking about the text, of our thought patterns, biases, expectations, and treatments of the text. And I think only by putting a lot of effort into understanding both the language and content of the text and the context in which it was written and published can we form an understanding of a text. Just as the process of understanding is always only an approach to a text and is never completely finished, the interpreter must not assume that understanding will come automatically, but must actively endeavor to achieve it. In doing so, he must acknowledge that he might miss some important aspects of the text during the hermeneutic interpretation and misunderstand certain aspects as well. By declaring misunderstanding and non-understanding to be the rule rather than the exception, Schleiermacher encourages us to read the text attentively, in detail and repeatedly. The constant expansion of our own knowledge and our own horizons, as well as the critical examination of the premises with which we approach texts, is also essential in order to enable an adequate understanding of the text. Finally, to answer the question, what could correctly understanding another person's speech or text mean? Finally, I want to say a little bit about what I think the quote of Schleiermacher to the term hermeneutics, meaning correctly understanding another person's speech or text, what that could mean. We have seen different forms of misunderstanding that show us ways of understanding wrongly. I think we can judge our own understanding best from this view. We shouldn't expect to understand something correctly right away. We can maybe refer to our own understanding as correct if we cannot find any falsehoods, problems, or contradictions in our own notion of a text after we made sure we put in thorough effort into understanding. But even in this case, hermeneutics asks us to improve our understanding of a text constantly, never to stop learning and engaging with it, rereading it, and also talking with others about it. I think we could come to a point at which you say have a right understanding or correct understanding of a text if you really engaged a lot with it, and if you really made sure that you put in a lot of effort, and also if your ideas about the texts resemble the ones that others have, because I think that's important, that your notion of a text is relevant to yourself, but if you want to talk to others about it and also try to reveal some deeper meaning of the text, I think it's always important to talk to others and see whether they have the same ideas about it or not, and if not, you could look at the text again together and make sure that you improve your understanding both ways. I think basically, all in all, this is the wonderful thing about hermeneutics, that it always asks us to engage further with the text, never to stop learning, never to stop reading, never to stop reading one text and saying, I've understood that, I will never read it again, I don't have to read it again. Instead, you can always discover something more, you can learn something more about the author, about the text, about yourself, about the literature, about the topics that it covers, about the themes, about the history that it might talk about. And I think the great thing of hermeneutics as a method is also that it doesn't really give you a one size or one fits all model that will just lead to understanding with a high success rate all the time, but it rather tries to give us general principles that can just serve as guidelines for understanding and interpreting, warning us about difficulties that can arise from our own approaches to the text. So that's been my short take on understanding and misunderstanding in adaptation of Schleiermacher's hermeneutics. I hope you enjoyed listening to me. The next video on Schleiermacher will be about the concept of the hermeneutic circle, what it is about, why it can be important for our interpretation of texts, how we can make use of it, and also what might be the problems about this. I hope you will stay tuned for that as well. And if you enjoyed listening, please consider subscribing to my channel, and we'll see you in my next video. Thanks for watching, and bye bye.